On this week's episode of the 262 Fishing Friday Forum, we're talking about how to jig for panfish through the ice. Before I get into this week's video, I want to actually backtrack a little bit. A couple weeks ago, I released a video about how to drill by hand with a hand auger, that hand crank style auger. And I made a comment that when you get down to the bottom and you get stuck, all you got to do is slam the auger down and slam it back up and that'll bust through. Well, I got a really good and a really insightful comment by Jeffrey Miller, who said that you should actually never do this. And in reading his comment and having a quick conversation with him about it, Jeffrey is absolutely right and I'm absolutely wrong. Yes, you can slam the auger down. Yes, it will get you through the ice. But what Jeffrey Miller's telling me, and it makes total sense, is that when you slam your auger down, you're potentially bending the angle of the blade in relation to the auger and the ice. If you remember my video, I talked about how the blades are angled a little bit, so the tip of your auger will actually break through the ice before the outside edges of your auger. Well, by slamming it down, you can potentially bend your auger and change the angle that your blades are cutting into the ice. And it's probably not going to do it a huge amount, but what I didn't realize, and probably most of us don't realize, is that it actually makes a huge difference even if that angle is off by just the slightest bit. And Jeffrey has a really good explanation in his comment, which I pinned to the top of that video. So go back, rewatch that video. If you want to give me some trash talk in the comment section as well and call me out for other stuff too, but make sure you read his comment because it's really good. It goes in depth about why we don't want to slam it, and his explanation for what we should do when we're at the end of the ice is awesome and spot on, and I've adapted it. Instead of slamming it through, just bring your auger up a little bit and just shave a little bit less off per rotation and it'll get itself through nice and easy. So thank you, Jeffrey, for that comment, and now let's get into the video. Alright, so this week's video is talking about how to jig for panfish through the ice, and we're again going to treat this like a very beginner video for maybe somebody that's never done it. And make sure you stick around to the end of this video because I will have some underwater footage of some of these baits using some of the techniques I talk about. Obviously, you need a rod and a reel, right? So this is a 13 fishing heat wave combo. The combo itself is like 20 bucks on Amazon. I think I got this one at the Fleet Farm out in Oconomowoc. But it's a fairly cheap way to get started. Obviously, it's going to be a lighter spool, a smaller spool. We're using lighter line and a much shorter rod, and it's going to be an extremely light action on the rod. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, well, we're fishing for panfish, but in the cold weather, they're a lot more lethargic, and so they're probably not going to be fighting as hard. That's why we can get away with 4-pound, 2-pound, even 1-pound test line. But also the action in the rod is going to come into play because we need a super light action because, like I said, these fish are more lethargic. The bite is going to be super light. It's going to be super delicate, and having a high action on your rod tip is going to help you see that bite that much easier. Of course, at the end of the line, we do need some sort of bait, and you'd be amazed at how small you can get away with some of these jigs. It's better probably to go too small than too big, again, because these fish are going to be finicky. So you can get away with some really small jigs, and you need some sort of bait at the bottom. In this case, I have a Basics Lures by Alex Ice Fishing Plastic. It's also very common to use waxworms and spikes as well, and you can get those at your local tackle shop. So let's talk about jig size, line size, what we're working with here. Line size is going to be up to you, but you want to go as light as possible because these fish, again, are going to be very finicky. You want the thinnest line possible to hide your line so that the fish only see the bait. So 1 pound, 2 pound, 4 pound, I wouldn't probably go much more than 6, and that's maybe if you're jigging for bass or walleye or something along those lines. As far as jig size go, this is really going to be more dependent on the depth that you're trying to get to. Hook size should be pretty small in these cases, but you do need to have a heavier jig to get down into some of the deeper waters, and then of course a smaller jig for the shallower waters because you don't need it to fall quite as quickly. So just something to keep in mind and play around with as well. If you have any suggestions for choosing a jig size, for choosing a hook size, comment down below so that we can all learn together. So now let's get into some of the technique for jigging for these panfish through the ice. And again, we'll assume that this is for beginner ice fisher people who maybe have never done this before. And so we're going to assume you don't have a ton of equipment. So we're going to pretend we don't have any way to see what's under the water. No underwater camera, no flasher, no sonar or anything like that. Certainly no Panoptics, right? So here's what you're going to do. You're going to just open your spool and you're going to let your line just drop all the way down until it stops. That way you know you're at the bottom. And what I like to do from here is give my reel about a half turn. That way I know I'm just barely above the bottom. From there, what I like to do is try and bounce my jig, just big motions, maybe a couple inches. Really all I'm doing is this with my wrist. And I'm letting the little bit in my wrist do all of the work here in the rod tip. But what I'm doing here is I'm bouncing my bait off of the bottom, and I'm trying to stir up any sand or dirt or anything down there, maybe try and ruffle the weeds a little bit, just sort of draw attention to my bait. I'm only doing this for a couple of seconds just to try and get the fish's attention, like, hey, my bait's here, take a look. And then from there I'm going to go to a more subtle presentation, and there's 3 ways that I go about this. The first way is to basically do the same kind of jigging motion, only a lot more discreet. And again, very, very little motion in your hand is going to translate to quite a bit of motion here on your rod tip. If I want to do something a little more subtle, I like to just sort of tap right on my rod. And that, of course, will give a more subtle action on the rod tip, which leads to a more subtle action in the bait. And then finally, I'll just hold it. I'll just dead stick it. And you won't be able to see it in your hand. I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the rod or not. So I'm holding my rod as still as possible. And you can still see it's bouncing just a little bit. And you got to remember, very little energy here with the pivot point creates more energy here. And then all that energy comes down this tiny, thin little line until it gets to this tiny little bait. So the slightest motions can actually make a big impact on what your bait is doing. So without further ado, let's take a look at what these actions do to these baits underwater. Now, I said no further ado, but I'm gonna have one quick further ado. I don't have an underwater camera like an Aquaview or anything like that, so we're just gonna have to deal with me in my kitchen with just a glass of water, but I'll talk you through what I'm doing as I'm doing it. Alright, first and foremost, we have bouncing off of the bottom. I have a lighter jig here with a Basics Lures by Alex Ice Fishing plastic, and I'm just bouncing it off the bottom. This is only a couple of seconds, and it's to get the fish's attention. From there, the next discrete presentation would be just sort of bouncing my hand up and down just a little bit, and you'll see even just a little bit of motion in my hand gives a pretty good action, gives quite a bit of motion into that bait. The next subtle presentation is just tapping my rod with my index finger, and you can see all that energy going from the rod down the line and into the bait still provides quite a bit of action and movement on that bait. And then finally just dead sticking it, holding it in my hand. But even the little tremors, whether it's picking up my pulse somehow or just my hand being a little shaky from a little too much coffee, you can see that still the tiniest bit of energy and the tiniest bit of movement gets transferred all the way through the rod, through the line, and all the way down into that tiny little bait. So the rest of these I'll just put some music on because it's all going to be repetitive talking, but it's going to be bouncing off the bottom, then a little bit of jigging motion, and then just tapping the rod, and then just dead sticking. We'll do another with Basics Lures by Alex Plastics, and then we'll throw some waxworms on there as well, so that you can sort of see the contrast of artificial versus live bait. Alright, so that's it for this week's Friday Forum. I hope some of you got some benefit out of this, especially those of you that are new to ice fishing. And I know a lot of you are more experienced than me, so drop a comment down below with some of your experience and how you prefer to jig for panfish through the ice, because we all learn better when we learn together. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the red down below to subscribe. I do Friday Forums every week, every Friday at 9 a.m., as well as Tuesday afternoons at 2, where I release my fishing videos. And I'm on a journey to catch a fish in every lake right here in Waukesha County, so make sure you're subscribed to catch that and more. And as always, folks, remember, it doesn't matter if you go around the world or go around the corner, just as long as you go fishing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the ice.